The legend of the temple could not be appropriately completed without a reference to Solomon, king of Israel, and some inquiry as to how he became indebted for the important place he has held in medieval Freemasonry. The popularity of King Solomon among the Eastern nations is a familiar fact, known not only to Oriental scholars, but even to those whose knowledge on the subject is confined to what they have learned from their youthful reading of the Arabian Nights' entertainments. Among the Arabians and the Persians, the king of Israel was esteemed as a great magician, whose power over the genii and other supernatural beings was derived from his possession of the omnific name, by the use of which he accomplished all his wonderful works, the said name being inscribed on his signet ring. It is not singular, seeing the communication which took place before and after the Crusades between the East and the West, that the wise son of David should have enjoyed an equal popularity among the poets and romancers of the Middle Ages. But among them the character that he sustains is not that of a great magician so much as that of a learned philosopher. Whenever a Norman romancer or a Provençal minstrel posed a religious morality, a pious declamation, or a popular proverb, it was the name of Solomon that was often selected to point the moral or adorn the tale. Unlike the Orientalists, whose tendencies were always toward the mystical, the medieval writers most probably derived their opinion of the King of Israel from the account of him and of his writings in the Bible. Now, there he is peculiarly distinguished as a proverbalist. Proverbs are the earliest outspoken thought of the people, and they precede in every nation all other forms of literature. It was therefore to be expected that at the awakening of learning in the Middle Ages, romancers would be fascinated by the proverbial philosophy of King Solomon rather than by his magical science, on which the Eastern fabulists had more fondly dwelt. Legrand d'Ossy, in his valuable work on the fables and romances of the 12th and 13th centuries, gives two interesting specimens from old manuscripts, the use made by their writers of the traditional reputation of King Solomon. The first of these is a romance called The Judgment of Solomon. It is something like the Jewish story of the two mothers. But here the persons upon whom the judgment is to be passed are two sons of the prince of Soissons. Claim advanced was for a partition of the property, to determine who was better entitled to be the heir, by the reverence he might exhibit for the memory of his father. Solomon required each to prove his knightly dexterity by transfixing a mark with his lance, and that mark was to be the body of his dead father. The elder readily complied with the odious condition. The younger indignantly refused. To him Solomon decreed the heritage. We see here how ready these romancers of the Middle Ages were to invent a narrative and fit it into the life of their favorite Solomon. The makers of the Masonic legend of the graft, who were their contemporaries, promptly followed their example. There is in that legend, as we have seen, some anachronisms, but none more absurd than that which makes a prince of Soissons, who could not have been earlier than the time of Clovis in the 6th century, the contemporary of a Jewish monarch who lived at least 16 centuries before Soissons was known as a kingdom. But it shows us the spirit of the age and how legends were fabricated. We are thus prepared to form a judgment of the Masonic myths. The Middle Ages also attributed to King Solomon a very familiar acquaintance with the science of astrology. In so doing, they by no means borrowed the Oriental idea that he was a great magician, for astrology formed no part of Eastern occult magic. The medieval astrologer was deemed a man of learning, just as at this day is the astronomer. Astrology was, in fact, the astronomy of the Middle Ages. Solomon's astrological knowledge was therefore only a part of that great learning for which he had reputation. In the collection of unpublished Fabliaux et Contes, edited by M. Méon, is a poem entitled Les lunaires que Salomon fist, that is, the lunary which Solomon made. The lunary, or lunarium, was a table made by astrologers to indicate the influence exerted by the moon on human affairs. The poem, which consists of 910 lines, written in the Old French or Norman language, contains directions for the conduct of life, telling what is to be done or what omitted on every day of the month. The concluding lines assign, without hesitation, the authorship to Solomon, while it pays the medieval tribute to his character. Here is ended the lesson made by the good King Solomon, to whom in his life God gave riches and honor and learning more than to any other born or begotten of woman. The canonical book of Proverbs gave the writers of the Middle Ages occasion to have an exalted opinion of Solomon as a maker of those pithy sayings, a characteristic of his genius of which the Orientals seem to have been unmindful. One of the most remarkable works of medieval literature is a poem by the Comte de Bretagne entitled Proverbs of Marcol and Solomon. This Marcol is represented as a commentator, rather, perhaps, a rival of King Solomon. The work is a poem divided into stanzas of 6 lines each. The first 3 lines contain a proverb of Solomon, the next 3 another proverb on the same subject, and in response by Marcol. There is another medieval poem in the collection of M. Méon entitled Of Marco and Solomon. The responsive style is the same as that of the Comte de Bretagne, but the 137 proverbs which it contains are all new. But still more apposite to the present inquiry is the fact that among the medieval writers Solomon bore the reputation of an artisan of consummate skill. He was like Volund or Wieland of the Scandinavian and Teutonic myths, the traditional smith who fabricated the decorations of chambers The comparison of war horses and the swords and lances of cavaliers. In the poems of the Middle Ages, whenever it becomes necessary to speak of any of these things as having been made with exquisite and surpassing skill, it is said to be the work of Solomon. Les Oeuvres Salomon. But enough has been said to show that King Solomon was as familiar to the romancers of the Middle Ages as he was to the Jews of Palestine or to the Orientalists of Arabia and Persia. Philip de Thunen, who in the 12th century wrote his Bestiary, a sort of natural history spiritualized, says that by Solomon was signified any wise man. Saces par Salomon sage gent entendum. Now, about the same time that these fable makers and songwriters of the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries were composing these stories about King Solomon, the makers of the Masonic legend of the craft were inventing their myths about the same monarch and the temple which he erected. This is a concurrence of time which suggests that possibly the popularity of King Solomon with the romancers of the Middle Ages made the incorporation of his name in the Masonic legend less difficult to those who framed that mythical story. We might, indeed, be led to suspect that the use of Solomon in their legends and traditions was first suggested to the stonemasons and to cognate associations such as the Compagnons de la Tour of France, from the frequent references to it by the contemporary romancers. But the subsequent myths connected with Solomon as the head of the association of Masons at the temple were, at a much later period, borrowed, in great part, from the Talmudists, and have no place among the songwriters and fabulists of the Middle Ages.